March 2020 wrap up. So I think that forevermore, when I'm thinking about March 2020, the books that I read this month are probably not going to be the most memorable part for me. As we all have experienced this month, it has been crazy, it has been distracting, and I was lucky in some ways that I had the books I was reading to read, because they've certainly helped me handle a lot of the stress and uncertainty that this month has brought to many of us around the world. But I also don't think it was very helpful to those books necessarily that I've been so distracted. So with that whole preamble done, I will talk to you about the books that I read. I'm going to start off today with the BookTube Prize books because I'm able to talk about them now, and I've already put out an extensive series of videos about these books, so I'm not going to go into them in any big detail. The first one that I did enjoy and one that went forward into the next round was No Visible Bruises by Louise Snyder. So that was a really well written book, great nonfiction. I have talked about it extensively in both my ranking video and in the vlog that I did while I was reading that book, so you can check that out. It's the second if you're interested in more details about that. And the other book that I read for the BookTube Prize in March was 5 Days Gone, The Mystery of My Mother's Disappearance as a Child by Cumming. Unfortunately, I bought this book and I didn't really enjoy it. So it had a few lovely parts to it, including this beautiful cover. And it had a few lovely passages of nature writing and some interesting little tidbits, but overall as a book it really was not my cup of tea. So I'm going to be taking this book to the local consignment secondhand bookstore I have and passing this on to them when it is open again and when things go back to some semblance of normal in the world. So I don't know when that will be, but yeah. So those were the two books that I read in March for the BookTube Prize. Another book I finished in March was the book I was reading with my son Elliot, and that was Call of the Wild by Jack London. I had never read this classic, and I did enjoy. Jack London is really good at nature writing as well, so some of the passages in that book that he wrote about the North were just stunning and really, really lovely. Obviously a book written in this time period, so I believe he wrote it in the early 1900s, had some problematic language, and so like when I was reading it to Elliot, who was 8 at the time when we were reading it, I just had to kind of explain to him where that language was coming from and why it was being used, and it had some harsh moments as well, because it's I don't know if it's necessarily a book written for children. I think there's a lot of harsh situations in that book that happen to the animals, like abuse of the animals and death, and like very graphic depictions of wild animals and things like that, and human cruelty as well. But overall, as a story, I think, you know, reading that classic and getting a kind of perspective for like the development of that type of writing was really great. Okay, so for my short stories, I want to read 12 short story collections this year. So number 2 was The Snows of Kilimanjaro and Other Stories by Ernest Hemingway. I had already read half of this book, so I was kind of cheating, but because I was nervous about how much time the BookTube Prize reading would take me, I wanted to kind of get a short story collection in, and I knew that I could finish this one in the allotted time. It ended up that the first story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and the last story, which is called The Short Happy Life of Frances McComber were my favorites. And you know, Hemingway, he's got a way with words. He can write a story that is that really pulls you in. And I know that his subject matter, again, it's interesting reading Jack London and Ernest Hemingway in the same month, because they do have both this kind of male 20th century male perspective on hunting and rough, wild, you know, men who are chauvinistic and these types of things. And so obviously when I read something like this, I take it with a grain of salt, but I don't, you know, there's still merit to his way of crafting a story that I really enjoy. So yeah, this was a good collection. I would say again, The Snows of Kilimanjaro and The Short Happy Life of Frances McComber were the two stories that stood out the most in this collection. On audio this month, I read The Lacuna by Barbara Kingsolver, and I have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed it, especially because it was narrated by Barbara Kingsolver herself. She got every accent with just so much feeling. So whether she was, you know, talking as Frida Kahlo, whether she was talking as Violet Brown, who was this Southern lady, she just had these amazing way of bringing the story to life. It was a very long audiobook, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I loved the symbolism. I loved the main character, Harrison Shepherd's view of the world. This story follows Harrison Shepherd from the time he's 12 until his death. He lives in Mexico with his mother, who is of Mexican descent. He also lives for a time in the United States. His father was American, his parents are divorced, and he kind of goes between them. He is a gay man, but his experience as a gay man is very kind of shrouded and mentioned in passing. And I think that's, you know, it was a very subtle way of sharing the reality of being a gay man in the 1930s, from Mexico to the United States into the 1950s, where he's dealing with the McCarthy era of communist witch hunts. And he just, you know, it was really well done. I especially love the sections with Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and Lev Trotsky. It made me want to read a biography of Trotsky. I think Kingsolver was able to bring this period to life through this character's eyes in a way that was just so entertaining, but also so warm. And you see Harrison as a cook, and so they talk a lot about the food. They talk a lot about his mannerisms and his way of being and his way of being in the world. And I just thought his perspective on the world was just such a unique character. There's very little about him that is a stereotype that you could stereotype to any character. So highly recommend the audiobook. I would not rule out rereading this in the future and reading it in hard copy, because I really, again, loved Kingsolver's interpretation of Mexico, and I think that it's got so many layers and so much richness in it that I could definitely get more out of it, even though I am familiar with the story. So it's a story that I want to delve more into in future. The big classic that I read during the month of March was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This was the first time that I was reading this book. And I think reading this book for the first time is obviously so monumental to so many readers, because this book is so beloved. It's so ensconced in the canon of English literature. And I get that. I get all the things that I get why it's there. I get the level of adoration. This book surprised me on several levels, and it surprised me in the way that I loved it, because I read Wuthering Heights when I was 16, and I have not reread it since, and I will in the future. But I find that just from memory of Wuthering Heights, and other people have commented about this too. I think Hannah from Hannah's Books has talked about this in a comment to me a long time ago about how she read Wuthering Heights after Jane Eyre and then was just disappointed because it didn't have the same thing going on. I think it was that order. Yeah. The thing that I love the most about Jane Eyre was the character of Jane herself. The love story, it was fine. It was good. It was solid. Mr. Rochester was never someone that I disliked. And I will say that I did know the plot because I've seen the movie. So I wasn't going into this story not knowing what happens. Like, I knew the arc, I knew all the things. I don't know. Should I spoil this story? Does everyone already know it? And so what I loved the most were the parts that the movie probably didn't go as into, which I thought were the strongest parts of Jane's character. I loved the beginning of her life. The time at the boarding school was fantastic. I loved that part. I loved how she grew and opened and blossomed and kind of had this maturity brought to her by being loved, by being given compassion, which she hadn't had as an experience with her aunt. I loved that part. When she got to Thornfield, I enjoyed that as well. I enjoyed her more without Mr. Rochester. So when she was separate from him, the things she thought about, the things that, happened in her mind. And then when she went off on her own and tried to figure out her life and become independent, and then how she found her second family and all of that part of her character. Like, there was a quote, and I don't have my iPad here that I read it on, but the gist of it was that she, the point of life is to endure and to push forward and to get through. And I really felt like that was the motto of that whole book, is that she endured and she went through and she became more and more herself with each thing that she went through. It was wonderful, and I'm so glad that I've read it, and I feel like having read it now, I can really sit back and just let it kind of wash over me slowly in future, because I think that it is a book that can develop with time and you'll gain more maturity with it, even though it really is a coming of age story, and coming of age story is not my favorite theme for a book. So, at the end when she's talking about, Mr. Rochester seeing his child for the first time and what happens to her cousins and all those things, I was like, oh, that would have been a really good book, like, to get into that, to know that part of her life. But I'm certainly so glad that I read it and thoroughly enjoyed the experience of reading it. That's all I've got for you today. I didn't get a whole heck of a lot of books read this month. I did start some new books right at the end of the month for Simon Savage's book Hibernation readathon, but I didn't finish any of those books, and I will talk about them at the end of April when I'm talking about my April reads. I hope that your reading month in March went okay, and I hope that everything going on in the world is going okay with you. I will be back again soon with my April TBR, and thank you so much for watching.